Let's have a serious talk, guys, about pawn moves. Yeah, I've realized that for some students rated under 1500, they have a tendency to be pretty impetuous with their pawn moves, not really appreciating their impact on the game. And the reason this is so important is that pawn moves are actually like piece trades. They are irreversible. So that's why when it comes to strategy, you have to be so careful with every pawn move that you make. So now we're going to go to some examples from my students' games. And okay, this is a student rated around 1300, just recently reached that level. And his opponent played b6 here. So the way I would think about that, I would obviously notice this pawn move, try to figure out what it's about. Black is probably planning to go there and lock up the queen side. But at the same time, there is a change here because the pawn is no longer protecting the other pawn. So the first thing I would think about is, does this pawn exchange favor me? Now, in the game, my student played queen d2, which is okay, but obviously it kind of shows that you're not too aware of this relationship and what it means. But let's take a look at this. So I suggested this move to him because, I love juicy strategic concepts like backwards pawns, outpost squares. So it seemed like a very natural trade to make. And my student was appreciating this. And he's like, oh, yeah. And here, I'm going to go b5. And I was like, no, you're not. Okay. b5. Okay, well, let's see what's the point of that move. The point is that you get a one move attack on the bishop. You're also going to your opponent's side of the board, taking some space. But are there downsides to that? I mean, are there any long-term impacts of that pawn move? And actually, guys, remember this one thing, that pawn moves leave behind squares, right? Like there's always something a pawn is controlling. And when it moves, it doesn't control it anymore. And it's up to you to figure out, is that important or not? In this position, I think this is a huge positional mistake because it gives you very temporary benefit. And it leaves you with a long-term weakness on this square, which your opponent is going to try to exploit by getting a knight there. So you've given them an outpost, and you've also created a backwards pawn for no reason whatsoever, right? So that's just one example of a move that you should be very careful about. It's not as simple as like, oh, I attacked my opponent's bishop, so therefore it must be good. I mean, every time a pawn moves, it's leaving a square behind. It could be important. Actually, a much better pawn move is this one. If you want to push a pawn, this is the way to go. And I'd actually normally be careful with that move because that runs into this type of answer where they try to get that square from you, but they don't have that answer right now because this pawn is going to hang. You're just going to go b5 now, and then you will take a free pawn, and that's a completely different scenario. So basically the point of this move is that we're going here. And that's a way of taking some space and opening your rook and opening your bishop and creating some weaknesses in your opponent's position that is actually without any noticeable drawbacks. So there's careful ways to move pawns, guys, that will improve your position. And then there's these weakening ways. Let's go to our next example. It's actually from a practice game I had against the same student. So in this position, he decided it was a good idea to attack my rook. So you kind of see there's a pattern in his thinking, like with these pawn moves. It's like, okay, you attack the rook, but you've also created a backwards pawn. You've also given the rook a great square on c4, which is an outpost. And what benefit do you have from that pawn being there, right? So that pawn is just so easy to attack, and then you got to sit passively and defend it. So that's, another very simple example, guys, of a pawn move that is both unnecessary and weakening. And instead, actually, the way you need to think about pawns is, let's say you look at the relationship of this rook and pawn. Right now, you're requiring the queen to guard it, which means the queen is a bit tied down. It's actually much more prudent to put the pawn like that, creating a mini pawn chain, right? So the pawns protect each other and the queen doesn't have to do it. That's actually why pawn chains are such an important concept in chess, because it's an efficient way to have your pawns protected without requiring pieces to do the job, so the pieces are free for other things. So building little pawn chains to kind of limit the power of your opponent's pieces is a good thing, but going for one move attacks that have no lasting benefit and produce long-term weaknesses is not a good thing. Now, finally, we're going to go to another example from a different student, also rated around 1300. And in this position, he decides, well, in some situations, black might like to take that pawn, so he's going to support it with the pawn. Now, maybe in itself, it's not like a losing move, but what I really want to bring your attention to, guys, is the relationship between this pawn and the knight. I think for players newer to chess, they tend to maybe not be aware enough of that relationship. Like, hey, that's a really stable relationship, and that's why the knight feels so good on that square, because the pawn's guarding it. And the moment that you change that, you really have to feel like how the knight just gets looser, even if nothing immediately happens to him. Like, right, there could be a pin at some point. And in general, when we put a pawn like that, it's because there's going to be a bishop taking the place of the pawn, right? A bishop fianchetto, and then the knight feels secure. But be kind of careful with just weakening that knight, because it feels kind of ugly. You're also actually weakening that square, I would say, right? So you're going to have trouble like putting a rook there, because you always have to worry about bishop a3. So you're weakening both the knight and the pawn, and there's no bishop to compensate for that on b2. So it's already pretty awkward as a pawn move, and I guess white realized that, because they were like, now let me protect those squares, right, guys? And this is examples of pawn moves that are just producing weaknesses. I mean, now your rook is stuck defending the pawn. It can't even move, right? So we don't want to tie our pieces down to protecting weak pawns that we created ourselves. And actually, the game was quite unfortunate, because within a couple of moves, quite unfortunate moves that white chose to do, we actually wound up basically losing the game because of that knight being unprotected. So not a great situation. And you see that pawn should have been back on b2. So the simple lesson is, guys, knights are pieces that enjoy being supported by pawns. And obviously we know that because we know knights enjoy outposts the most of any other piece. But even like from the start of the game, when they go to squares like that, there is a connection between pawns. So make sure you're kind of aware of that so you don't create hanging pieces. And our final example is from a recent Grandmaster game, Bartel versus Tabatabai from the London Chess Classic, played just a few days ago. And this is actually an interesting game that we're going to look at in more detail in another video. But this is a position from an opening that occurred that I posed to some of my newer students. And I asked them, how would you like to protect that pawn? Right? Because the black queen went out to attack it. And one of the suggestions, yes, believe it or not, was b3. Now, again, for a new player, that might just be like, oh, I'm protecting the pawn. But remember what I told you guys. What about that relationship? That is a relationship you want to protect. And you just loosen the knight, your king's not castled, and you can expect some really terrible things to happen to your knight as a result of breaking that bond. So there's a bond, guys, between your pawns on b2 and the knight it's protecting. So pay attention to that, and we'll talk about how that pawn could have been protected in a more harmonious way in the future. So yeah, I think this is a nice short video, guys, on something that a lot of players under 1500 could use, right? This concept of being aware of the impact of their pawn moves and making sure they're not just leaving behind weaknesses when they're pushing their pawns. So like every pawn move is irreversible. It has the potential to be good and be gaining space or gaining time by attacking other pieces. But it also has the potential to leave behind other weak pawns or weak squares in its wake. So pay special attention to pawn moves the same way that you do to piece trades.